There is a painting held in a private collection in Amsterdam, dated somewhere around the late 17th century, that shows a vast interior hall unlike anything you might expect from that era. The walls are stone, thick and pale, the kind of pale that speaks not of poverty, but of deliberate engineering. And in the center of the room, surrounded by what appear to be children dressed in layered wool and fur, sits a structure that no historian has ever adequately explained. It is not a fireplace. It is not an oven in any conventional sense. It is a tower of ceramic and copper, rising nearly to the ceiling, its surface engraved with geometric patterns that repeat in a manner more consistent with mathematical precision than decorative craft. Outside the frosted window behind the children, there is nothing but white. An infinite, consuming white. The year inscribed at the bottom of the painting is 1684. That year is not chosen arbitrarily. In the winter of 1683 to 1684, Europe and the lands far beyond its eastern borders experienced what climatologists and historians now call one of the most extreme cold events of the entire Little Ice Age. The Thames froze solid. The Baltic Sea iced over from shore to shore. Rivers across the continent became roads. Wolves walked into villages in France. And in the vast interior of the Eurasian continent, in those endless plains stretching from the Ural Mountains to the Pacific coast that were labeled on every major European map of the time as Tartaria Magna, the cold was not an emergency. It was simply winter. And the people who lived there, whoever they truly were, had not merely survived it. They had, it seems, built an entire civilization around it. This is what the official history refuses to sit with for very long. The moment you begin to look at the cartographic record of the 17th and 18th centuries, the moment you pull out an atlas produced by Jodocus Hondius in the early 1600s, or flip through the geographical compendium assembled by Petrus Bertius, you encounter something that should provoke serious questions in any intellectually curious person. There, occupying more than half of the known world's landmass, is a territory labeled with remarkable consistency across dozens of independent map-making traditions. Grand Tartary, Tartaria Magna, Le Grand Tartary. The names shift with the language of the cartographer, but the presence on the map does not. It is there in the 1570 Ortelius Atlas. It is there in the 1595 Mercator edition. It is described with its own internal divisions, its own rivers and mountain ranges, its own named capitals and seasonal territories, in the first edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, published in 1771, which devotes a substantial entry to Tartary, describing it as the greatest empire on the face of the earth by territorial extent. And then, over the course of the 19th century, it disappears, not conquered in a single famous war, not absorbed by a rival empire in a documented campaign that school children learn by name. It simply contracts, dissolves, gets parceled out between the expanding Russian Empire moving east and the British Empire pressing north from India. And by the time you reach the maps of 1850, the word Tartary has become almost quaint, an embarrassment to the new geographical order, a relic that scholars quietly retire without ever properly accounting for what it represented. But here is what draws us back to that painting, back to that ceramic tower, surrounded by children in 1684. Because if you accept, even provisionally, that there was a sophisticated civilization occupying that enormous territory during those centuries, then the question of how that civilization managed the cold becomes one of the most revealing puzzles in the entire field of what some researchers are now calling suppressed architectural history. And the answer, when you begin to look at the physical evidence still surviving in the buildings of Central Asia, Siberia, and Eastern Europe, suggests a level of thermal engineering that should not, according to the conventional timeline, have been possible. Walk through the old quarter of any city that sits within the historical borders of Tartaria. Walk through Kazan or Tobolsk or Samarkand, or even certain districts of St. Petersburg where the construction clearly predates the official founding date of the city. Look at the walls, not at their decoration, not at their painted facades, but at their actual thickness. In the structures that local historians will tell you were built in the 18th century by newly arrived Russian administrators, you will find walls that measure, in some cases, over 2 meters thick. 2 meters of a specific combination of materials: an outer skin of brick, a cavity filled with a material that analysis has shown to be a mixture of crushed volcanic pumice, animal hair, and a clay compound, and then an inner skin of stone or fired ceramic tile. This is not the construction technique of a culture that learned about insulation by accident. This is the construction technique of a culture that had spent generations refining a response to cold so severe that it became the central organizing principle of architecture itself. The windows compound the mystery. This is where the mud flood researchers have focused much of their attention, and rightly so, though the explanation they encounter from the mainstream tends to be dismissive. Across this vast region, and indeed in buildings that appear in cities far beyond it, including in the Americas and in parts of Western Europe, that received waves of what official history calls colonial-era construction, you find the same anomaly repeated with a persistence that demands explanation. The first floor of the building is below grade, not because the ground rose around it after a flood, not because the street was raised for drainage purposes, as local authorities often claim, but because the windows at what should be the ground level of the structure are half buried, their upper halves still visible, sometimes with their original glass intact behind a wall of packed earth. In the Russian provincial towns along the Ob River, in the old merchant districts of Omsk and Tomsk, there are entire streets where this pattern holds. Buildings whose upper stories are magnificent, whose proportions are grand and confident, and whose first floors have simply been swallowed by the earth. The conventional explanation is mundane. Sediment accumulation over time. Deliberate raising of street levels for sanitation or flood management. But here is the detail that the conventional explanation cannot comfortably absorb. In many of these buried first floors, when they have been excavated by curious private researchers rather than official archaeological bodies, the interiors are intact. The floor tiling is undamaged. The plaster on the walls is still adhered and, in some cases, still painted. The wooden fittings are preserved not by a flooding, but by the cold itself, sealed under the insulating layer of earth, like specimens in a freezer. And in several documented cases in the Siberian interior, researchers have found those lower chambers configured not as storage rooms or servant quarters, but as sophisticated thermal systems. Channels cut into the stone floors, ceramic conduits running through the walls, arrangements of space that only make sense if you understand them as part of a building that was designed from its foundation upward to manage temperature as its primary engineering function. Think about what winter at 60 degrees north latitude meant in 1684. Not the romantic winter of holiday imagery, but the actual physiological and architectural challenge of months in which the air outside could reach temperatures that would kill an unprotected person in under an hour. The Tartarian response to this challenge, if we follow the evidence the buildings themselves provide, was not simply to build bigger fires. The evidence suggests something considerably more sophisticated, something that researchers in the alternative history community have begun calling antiquitech, a term that covers a range of proposed technologies embedded in the architecture of the old world, whose function the modern world has either forgotten or has chosen not to discuss openly. The ceramic tower in the painting from 1684 is the key that unlocks this. These structures have a name in the Russian tradition that inherited them without fully understanding them. They are called pechkas. Though the pechka, as described in the folk tradition, is a simple masonry oven, and the structures visible in the older buildings are something considerably more complex. They are not heating the room by burning fuel in an open firebox and releasing heat through convection in the straightforward way that any household stove does. The internal geometry of the older ceramic towers. When you can find one that has not been gutted and rebuilt during the Soviet-era renovations of the 20th century, involves a series of internal chambers and channels that cause the combustion gases to travel in a specific spiral path before exiting through a narrow flue. The thermal mass of the ceramic body absorbs heat from those gases over an extended period and then radiates it slowly, evenly, for hours or days after the fire itself has gone out. This is not medieval technology fumbling toward efficiency. This is thermodynamic engineering that requires a precise understanding of heat transfer, combustion chemistry, and material science. And if you extend the framework of antiquitech further into the realm that more speculative researchers have explored, how you encounter the theory that these structures were not operating on combustion alone, the specific geometry of some of the more elaborate examples, the spiral configurations, the use of particular clay compounds that have been shown to have unusual piezoelectric properties, the placement of these towers at what appear to be geomagnetically significant locations within the building. All of this has led some researchers to propose that the Tartarian thermal system was drawing on something beyond simple fuel combustion. The Earth itself, in the Tartarian theory, was understood to be a source of energy. The cathedrals with their spires and their specific proportions, the star forts with their geometric precision, the grand civic buildings with their domes and their copper ornamentation. All of these are proposed to be nodes in a network that drew upon the planet's own electromagnetic field. In this framework, surviving winter was not merely a question of burning enough wood. It was a question of alignment, of resonance, of a relationship between built form and natural energy that the civilization of Tartaria had cultivated over centuries and that was severed, along with everything else, in whatever catastrophe brought that civilization to its end. The catastrophe is the shadow that falls over every attempt to understand 1684 and the winters that surrounded it. Because the 1683 to 1684 winter was extreme even by the standards of the Little Ice Age, and some researchers who approach this material from a geological and climatological angle have pointed out that extreme cold events of this magnitude have in the past been associated with other kinds of disruption: volcanic activity, atmospheric loading with particulate matter. Events, in other words, that do not have to be entirely natural in their origin. The Tartarian reset theory, in its more developed forms, proposes that the great civilization of the interior was not merely bypassed by history, but was actively terminated by a combination of geological or climatological catastrophe and deliberate human erasure. The orphans of the 19th century, the tens of thousands of children who appear in institutional records across Europe and America with no documented parentage and no clear origin, are cited in this framework as the human remnant of a population that was disrupted so completely that its genealogical continuity was broken. The new world that emerged from the chaos of the late 18th and early 19th centuries needed workers, needed citizens, needed a population that did not remember what had come before, and the orphan trains and the poorhouses and the foundling institutions provided exactly that. What survived in the Tartarian framework survived in stone. The buildings are the memory, the walls 2 meters thick that kept the cold at bay in 1684 are still standing in some cases, still inhabited, their function now misunderstood, their origins attributed to a Russian governor or a colonial administrator who arrived generations after the structure was already complete. The ceramic towers have mostly been removed or rebuilt, but their ghosts remain in the chimney configurations of old buildings, in the inexplicable chambers found beneath the floors of renovated structures, in the occasional discovery of a sealed room whose contents suggest a life and a technology that the official date on the building's cornerstone cannot accommodate. What this means for you, wherever you are watching from, is simpler than it might seem. It means that somewhere near you, if you are in a city of any age, there is likely a building whose walls are thicker than they need to be. For any structural reason the current engineers can identify, there is likely a basement or a sub-basement whose original function no one in the building can explain. There may be a window that sits lower than it should, all half obscured by a rise in the pavement that predates anyone's memory. These are not accidents. In the Tartarian understanding, they are messages. They are the architecture speaking across a gap of deliberate forgetting, telling anyone who pauses long enough to listen that the people who built this place understood winter and water and earth and energy in ways we have not yet been honest enough with ourselves to fully examine. The ice inside the homes of 1684 was not a failure of heating. It was a feature, a way of preserving food and medicines through a winter that lasted half the year, a way of managing the thermal gradient between the buried first floor and the heated upper chambers, so that the entire building became a regulated environment. It was, in its own way, a technology as sophisticated as anything we congratulate ourselves for inventing. And the civilization that developed it has no monument, no recognized dynasty, no celebrated founding myth in any textbook you were ever handed in a classroom. It has only its buildings, its maps, and the slow, persistent hum of a question that refuses to go away. Who were they really? And what did they know that we have forgotten?